Did you all get that notification? Oh, there's Zach. We'll wait for him. All right. Wonderful. So my name is Frida Heitland. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oregon, focusing on comic studies and eco-criticism. And I am also the Secretary Treasurer for the Graduate Student Caucus of the CSS. And in that function, it is my pleasure to introduce both our speakers today. I'll start with Katie Pryde. Katie did her undergrad work at the University of Oregon and graduate work at Cornell University, completing an MA and abandoning a PhD, ABD in Science and Technology Studies, focusing on embodied practice and physical culture in astronomy and cartography in the US in the first half of the 19th century. At the time she left her graduate studies, she had one infant kiddo and was expecting another, so took a break to be a full-time parent for a few years. That does not sound like a break. Well, along with the kids, he also ran a family biking nonprofit, Critical Mass, and co-founded Stealing Time, a literary magazine for parents. In 2013, she returned to full-time work as a partner at the tech training consultancy in Kuhn, I hope I'm not butchering that, helping startup tech companies onboard and train new talent. And in 2016, left InCune to found Books with Pictures, an explicitly and aggressively inclusive comic book store in Portland, Oregon. In 2022, Katie was the second solo woman to win the Will Eisner Spirit of Comics Retail Award, making Books with Pictures the best comic shop in the world. Yay, congrats.
For now, I'm gonna hold on to it all the way until we give the award again next year.
Yes. I mean, until that, we'll be milking that.
Right, absolutely.
Our second guest today is Andrea Gilroy. Dr. Andrea Gilroy earned her PhD from the University of Oregon in 2015, examining how comics represent identity. After graduation, she worked as a comics educator by teaching courses at UO and Portland State University, acting as the 2016-2017 interim director of the UO Comics and Cartoon Studies program, serving on the board of the International Comics Arts Forum, curating and helping build comics exhibits, speaking at conferences and conventions, and building the free YouTube channel Comics Crash Course. So definitely check that out later. In March 2020, she pivoted from academia to business and founded Books with Pictures Eugene, the sister store to the award-winning Books with Pictures in Portland. Despite the terrible timing, right before the pandemic, about 2 weeks, I think I've been told, Books with Pictures Eugene survived the pandemic and continues to grow. Andrea is thrilled to build a space that uses the power of comics and the passion of fans to build community. All right, that's enough for me. I will mute myself and hand over to our wonderful speakers. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here.
Thank you, Frida.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, this is great. I recognize a handful of names here. And we're getting to the point where I don't recognize all the names in comic studies anymore, which is a little sad, but also, this is how we grow. We move on. But it's nice to see some familiar names and to chat with some of the new names. When I saw, I believe, Josh Copen and Maite, I don't know how to pronounce her name offhand. I don't have it in front of me, so I'm not going to try. But I'm sure many of you know Maite. I had posted something about like alt-ac studies for GSC, and I got in touch with Josh because Josh is a contemporary of mine, and as is Maite, and said, who should I talk to about this? Because I would love to chat more, having gone through this process and done some weird things that are somewhat unique to comic studies grad students. And so that's how we got started. When I was speaking with Frida and Zach, brought up the idea of being in conversation, and I was like, well, I should clearly converse with my award-winning partner who taught me pretty much everything I know when it comes to comic book business.
Which is good because we do it a little weird.
We do. Of course, when we start chatting together, it becomes a conversation pretty quick. So I imagine that this will largely be pretty freeform. Please jump in with questions. But I think we are happy to kind of get started. Katie, the topic of the day, at least, so Katie came up with the name. of the talk. I
It
gotta
was
hear
my academic title. I made you an academic title. It has a colon in it, and
everything. Yeah, Katie's like, should we do retail as practice or this longer one? And I was like, retail as practice, longer subtitle. It's been not so long from academia. But I want to talk a little bit about retail as praxis, because that's the place to start. I know there's some questions generally about like transfer of skill and what it means to go from an academic lifestyle to this thing, but they all kind of tie together in a knot that is difficult to unravel. So the idea of retail as praxis, it's not, I didn't come up with it, but Katie, a lot of it comes from a story from you.
yeah.
Share
So
story.
yeah, it was actually, it was one of my colleagues. So when I was in grad school, I was in an interdisciplinary program, science and technology studies, and I mostly hung out with the historians. But we also had folks who were in English, and we had folks who were in sociology, and we had folks who were in political science, philosophers, very few, but a couple of philosophers. And what we all had in common is that we all worked on science in some way or another, science and society. And we all sort of had a home department and then our interdisciplinary department. And then I also helped to run a writing group for grad students who were interested in writing sort of for a general public. And so that was mostly historians. It was called HA, which was historians are writers, or historians as writers. I'm not entirely sure, but it was fun to say HA. And we had, monthly meetings where we passed around writing samples and tried to hone our craft as writers. And it was a very good group. It was very like social group. We met at a professor's house. It was always potluck. We had dinner. It was very cozy. And one of my colleagues from there, who was actually guesting in the history department from English, we had a lot of talks about how she had all these things that she wanted to say as a scholar, and she felt like she didn't want to just say them to other scholars. She wanted to say them more broadly to the public. And when do you even get to do that? You spend all this time writing this paper that you think is really important and very, very smart. And then like the 12 people who do exactly what you do read it, and that's a success. And so she was like, well, I just need to get my stuff into the Atlantic. I need to get my stuff into like popular publications so that like more people can read what I have to say. So we had that conversation, a dozen times. And then she actually sort of snuck into my store. She had finished and she was guest lecturing at PSU and had not told me. And so she had come into town and then come into my store and was just sort of lurking and watching me sell things to customers and talk to this customer about, what a good feminist reading, Bitch Planet was, and this other customer about, the social political consequences of Miles Morales' Spider-Man. And then I turn around and she's there and I sort of yelp because I have a very sensitive startle response. And she says to me, "You're doing it. This is praxis. This is it. This is what we were trying to do the whole time." And I'm like, yes, retail. But it's true. That in a lot of ways, the ways of thinking that you get as an academic do not leave you just because you are no longer living in academia. And in particular, sort of the ways of thinking about the world complexly and different elements as interconnected feels great when what you're trying to do is find someone exactly the right comic book to read. It's so much that skill, even though that sounds silly. But you all know it's not silly, right? So anyway, that was my story about darling Sarah, who I think is at Madison now, so good for her. And yeah.
Yeah, this was a conversation that you and I had a lot when I was getting started. The origin story, I think I mistyped, but typed it as storage story, and I think we're gonna stick with that.
Storage stories, that's what we're doing here.
I was at the tail end of academia. Some of you may be there right now, some of you may be heading there, where as much as I loved the teaching, as much as I was passionate about the subject, the sort of bureaucracy and the instability of what it meant to be an adjunct, even a relatively successful adjunct, it's just getting to me in a way that like I could feel it rubbing off on my students. I could feel it rubbing off in like the quality and attention I had in work, and I needed to do something different. We were at a Janelle Monáe concert at Edgefield. This was
We're sitting on the lawn,
On the
being
lawn.
relatively like intoxicated and cozy. It was very nice.
Feels correct, actually. It feels the ideal space for it. But Katie was like, if I ever opened up a second store, you should run it. And I was like, huh. My town really needs a space like Books with Pictures. And yeah, a year and a half later, there I was opening the doors. And in part because a lot of these conversations that Katie and I had been having, like, this retail is praxis story, right? That there is more to creating a space and putting it out in the world than just renting a building. So what it is that you do with the space, how you advertise the space, what kinds of things you carry, all of that becomes philosophical and practical as much as it is practical. And you have to start thinking about it early on. And I'm sure many of you have been in comic shops that, the comic shop guy from The Simpsons, I guess maybe like I haven't seen much of The Big Bang Theory, but I understand there's also a terrible comic shop in The Big Bang Theory. And it's probably more updated and relevant than Comic Shop Guy at this point, but that's an experience that a lot of us have. And it doesn't have to be that way, clearly. And more, I think shops are beginning to turn toward a newer model of what it means to create a space. Like the term third space gets thrown around a lot. In that, you have your home, you have your work, and then there are these third spaces that can be a kind of space that you claim as your own, as part of your identity, as part of your community, that are not either work or home. There are, of course, like complications sometimes with that being retail related, that sometimes all that big philosophy and thinking and thinking about social justice on a deeper level can sometimes make things a little complicated with the fact that it's like for-profit retail. I suppose there are questions about whether or not it's non-for-profit and that kind of thing. That could be a different discussion, but or maybe here later. But we are where we're at, and I feel like this is one way that you can really have an impact on the community and create a community in a lot of spaces and towns, because it's a space that can serve a lot of people. I think our model is more, we're in a joint Facebook group called, what is it? Comic book bookshops, comic book bookstores. So it's modeled more on a kind of bookstore space than necessarily a comic shop space. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And I've been chatting now for like 5 minutes, so I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I could jump on all sorts of things. I think like the choice to be a retail space is a really interesting one when what you want to be doing is creating community, right? Because if the goal is to have an inclusive space and create community, you don't want to exclude people who don't have money to spend. On the other hand, the thing that keeps the shop running is money coming in, at least in theory. Not just an endless grind of debt, but actual income does help. And so for me, and what I tell the staff is that our first goal is to be this space for our community, and that our second goal is to be a sustainable version of this space for our community. And so when people come in who have needs that are at odds with the sustainability of the space, we need to make different choices about sort of how they are using our space. And I have the weird advantage of living above my shop. I live in an apartment over my store. So the other day I had a very regular customer come in and have an emotional breakdown as soon as they walked in the door because they'd had a real bad day. And like that person gets invited upstairs because you need to have that emotional breakdown. You cannot have it right here on the shop floor. Let's go have a cup of tea, right? But also it means that like when somebody needs a place to shelter or sleep all day long, they can't do it in the store because that is not a sustainable way to run a store. And so, you know, these are real things that we weigh. But at the same time, like there are other things that we weigh, like I do not put comic books above cover price on the floor. I sell them on eBay, but I don't sell them on the floor. I don't display them. And the reason for that is because for me as a pre comics retail comic book fan, coming into my regular shop and seeing the like $100, $500, $2,500 books sitting up front in sort of places of honor, to me indicated that I was not a good enough fan, because a good fan would be buying those. And I didn't understand why I would want those. They're pretty, but are they $100 pretty? Like I'm on a grad student salary. What are we doing here? And not being that kind of collector felt very off-putting to me. And so for me, in order to create the sense that we are here for story and we are here for community and we are not here for that sort of fetishistic collecting, not that there's anything wrong with it, just that it's not the kind of community I'm trying to generate. There are like concrete things I've done to create that sense. And there's lots of elements of that design, making sure that books for little kids are at levels where little kids can grab them.
Books for little kids, you know.
What's that?
I said even having books for little kids,
Yeah.
frankly. A lot of comic shops or particularly that cater more towards collectibles, or even just shops that aren't necessarily like collectible. Comic shops would have lots of like stuff and things, tend to be suspicious of kids because, you know, little 5-year-olds like to run around and yell and take things off the shelf. And, you know, I'm sure that you have also gotten notes from parents that are grateful that like, we're not freaking out that a kid is in the store. It's like,
well, and also the reason I don't carry toys, even though toys are actually a really good sideline in comic shops, is because I want to create a space where parents can take their kids and say, you can have something,
mm-hmm.
and not have that fight of, no, you need to get a book, not a stuffed animal. Having had that fight with my own children a million times, you know, no, we're here for books, we're at the bookstore, but there's the stuffed animal at the bookstore. Why can't I have the stuffed animal? I just don't want, I want to take that fight off the table.
Right.
And probably lose money for that particular call. But
neither of us Funko Pops, Zach.
But it changes the vibe of the space to be able to say you can have anything you want from here because it's what you're going to buy as a book.
Right. And there's something about, I think a lot of us have experienced it, about being, I mean, probably all of us have experienced it, right, with grad students, being in a bookstore, and it is a type of retail space that is a different kind of feeling than a collectible store or, you know, any kind of thing. And I think part of that is built from our experiences with libraries. I mean, I'm sure you get asked quite a lot. I get asked frequently, especially I'm only a block north from the Eugene Library. So we get asked a lot like, oh, is this like a library? And I was like, no, please buy your books. You can read a little. But that kind of feeling that like, this is a space where I can quietly explore and look around and find things and get little glimpses of an experience, even if they leave without having bought anything.
Well, and initially, like if you look at my business plan, the explicit reason that there's a kids section in my store initially was because I wanted to create a space where women would come and read comic books, and women are disproportionately carers of children. And so if you want any woman to be able to come into the store and buy a comic book, one of the things that you need to do is create a space where she can come with her children. Because those opportunities for getting away without the kids are difficult. And so that was a priority for me. I also had little kids at the time that I was starting the shop, and they would not have let me get away without it. But initially it was like, no, I need to have a space for kids to be, because I need to sell Mom Bitch Planet. And I don't know how to get Mom in here to buy Bitch Planet if I don't have a place for a kid to go and find. SpongeBob, which was running at the time, which was very, very good, and it doesn't run anymore, and I miss it because it was the best thing to hand to a 4-year-old. Miss SpongeBob. They were very clever. They were very well done. Anyway, and now like children's books are 30% of our business, and I don't think that we would be in business without them. But also the books available for kids are so much better than they were even 7 years ago. Like, wow, middle grade graphic novels have exploded in the last 7 years. It's great.
And you know, to be perhaps a bit crass, but honest, it's also where the money is.
Yep.
It's particularly in the comic book industry. I know a lot of us will use the parlance of the big two and be referring to DC and Marvel. I still use it because, you know, that's what I grew up using. But the big two actually, by like exponential amounts, are Viz and Scholastic.
Yep.
But you know, like unreasonably far and away and above and beyond anything that Marvel or DC are putting out these days.
Yeah. Other structural things about the shop, we both of us use the same, Andrea's are better because they got built later, but the same shelf design that are make sure that every comic is displayed full face and not overlapping any other comic, which for me is partly because the way my brain works, when comics overlap each other, it feels very, very busy and distracting, and I kind of can't look at the shelf for too long. But also because we really wanted the opportunity to sort of highlight the art as art, and not just as products. We wanted to sort of give them room to breathe artistically, and make it not a world-ending thing when the cover of the title of the comic is printed at the bottom of the cover, which is irresponsible. But you know, it's a thing. And then we really, I don't know about you, Andrea, well, I do really, but we're very careful to sort of do weekly inventories and look at which books are faced in the store in addition to the single issues, which trade paperbacks are faced, and sort of make sure that fewer than half of the characters on those covers are white dudes. Like it should just be a space where when you look around, you see not just white male superheroes. And I do remember very, very clearly one of my sort of motivators for starting the store is that I have a lot of anxiety. I'm an anxious person. I'm sure it's a grad student thing, among other things. And I noticed that sitting down with my comics was very good for my anxiety. Like sitting down with my weekly pull and reading them was very grounding and good. But if I was having a bad anxiety week, I couldn't go to the comic book store because it took so much emotional work to walk into the room, not notice that TNA poster, not notice that the comics clerk is looking at me funny, not feel like I need to prove myself to all the dudes in the back of the room who are picking up their pulls, and just get my shit and go home. If I was having an already bad anxiety week, dealing with that space was too much for me, and I would send somebody else to go get them. So, and there was just a day where it sort of like snapped, where I like realized how much work was going into not getting angry and stressed out when I went to the comic shop. And I was like, what if we just create a space where it doesn't feel like that? What if I created a space where it actually feels good to go in and get my books? As a woman, as a queer person, as a, you know, whatever, like, how do I make this feel better? And so for me, part of that is really just paying a lot of attention to the visual sort of sphere. Andrea has a fish. We both have a lot of plants, like, you know, sort of ways to soften the space and make it feel more lived in, comfortable.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I think we both will occasionally use the term aggressively when talking about how we're inclusive. And that comes from, a point that, Katie, you walking by a shop and you don't know when you're walking by if it's going to be a place that's anxiety inducing or not.
Right.
At least most of the time. It could be the nicest, most wonderful place in the world. But comic shops have a reputation. Comic studies sometimes has a reputation that's changing, but there's, the entire world has a reputation of a sorry, Corey, but old white guys. And a lot of gatekeeping in particular, and in particular in this, and stuff around comics. So we have to make that kind of, we have to translate those thoughts and this kind of philosophy and these ideas about what makes a space welcoming, what makes it inclusive, what makes it a good comic shop too, like frankly, there's also that part. But that has to be translated very quickly, right up front. Because if you're not yelling it, people don't know.
Well, and that's, to me, I know that when I came into the scene and was like, I'm a queer feminist comic shop, and a lot of my colleagues in town responded with a very defensive, well, everyone's welcome here too. And on the one hand, yes, of course they are. And on the other hand, how would they know? If you are a person who has been excluded from every one of this kind of space that you've ever been into, how do you know that this one's going to be okay? And so for me, the objective was to really start from a perspective of designing with kids in mind, and with parents in mind, and with women in mind, and with people of color in mind. How do we make sure? I actually did a few informational interviews with parents of children with disabilities. So a mom of a kid with Down syndrome, a mom of a kid who's deaf, and talking to them about, what do you need to be comfortable bringing your kid into a space, and how is that different from me? Like, I know what my kids need, but I don't know what your kids need. And one of the mom of the kid with Down syndrome was like, look, my kid's a runner. He's strong and he's big for his age. And if he can see a clear line to the door, he will run. So what I need is a space where I can stand with my kid, where I can look at books and he can't see the door. And I was like, whoa, I would not have thought of that thing, right? Like, that's not, my perspective doesn't give me that, but being attentive to the needs of other people tells me that.
Yeah, and this is where I think we can talk a little bit about where some of the academic training comes in, because that kind of I have this thing and it is philosophical and it is brainy and it is abstract, and I have to kind of turn it into something else, whether that's a classroom lesson or an objective or, a couple of sentences on paper. And that skill isn't exclusive to grad school, but in grad school, you probably, we'll leave room for those of us who aren't doing well this week, but you probably get pretty good at it. And so this and of course, both Katie and I come from comparative fields as well. So we're also already kind of from a methodological base, like everything's connected kind of spirits aboard, like,
have you considered the systemic factors? Yeah.
Right. And I know one of the broader questions is, what are some of the other ways in which your training in academia did or perhaps did not kind of shift or prepare you for this kind of switch to a different, what on the one hand seems like a totally different field, and on the other hand kind of feels like, like you started saying, just kind of the next step.
I'm going to tell you the worst thing that definitely prepared me for those first 2 years where everything is crunch time, and I've been unlearning since. Listen to me closely. when you are a grad student, there is literally always more work. However many texts your prof thinks you're reading this week is probably not as many texts as you are actually reading this week, but you told them you would, and it just means that you can read forever, except you can't because you have a response paper you have to write and it's due tomorrow. And also there's one the next day. And also you're teaching a class and you've got grading to do and you've got a presentation you need to put in for the conference. There is always more work in grad school and you can just work forever, which if you have a particular kind of brain is very satisfying right up until you hit a wall and burn out, right? Yep. Small business is also exactly like that. And learning how to work like a grad student makes it really easy to work like a kind of dysfunctional small business owner. And it's great while it lasts, and then you burn out really hard, and then you need to find something else because boundaries. But I do think that like that particular style of working that grad studenting trains you to do, it's great for small business, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, it's this constant struggle between I have something that is immediately due. I have this long-term project that I'm also working on, and this other long-term project that I'm also working on that this kind of has to do with, but not exactly the same. And maybe if I move it around a little bit, I can actually make it make sense. That is what it's like. And certainly not just running a comics retail shop. In a lot of sort of small business or entrepreneurial settings. It is good to know how you work and how best to prevent that kind of burnout from happening. I think, certain personality types is probably always inevitable. You're just gonna work yourself until you freak out for a little bit.
And it's also what makes the work fascinating, right? Like you don't get bored. It's different every day.
Yeah. There's always something to juggle. But I think when I finally felt like I was, and it took a couple of years in grad school, but when I finally felt like I'm figuring out how I work and when I work best, and like, does it make sense for me to get up at 8:30 every morning and write for half an hour before I've had my coffee? No, that does not work for me, but other things do. And finding how like you work best and thinking critically about what makes sense to help you be productive is a really important part, not just of grad school, but of your ongoing life, frankly.
I did want to say one of the questions that Frida sent us beforehand was sort of what would you recommend for someone who is planning a bookstore career? And on the one hand, like, I don't think that this is where, like, if I knew I was going here, I probably wouldn't have stayed in grad school as long. I don't think you need to have a PhD to open a bookstore. There's lots of valuable things from working on a PhD, and also they're useful in running a bookstore, but it's not like a clear and direct career path. That said, if I had planned grad school, how would we say? If I had even had an inkling that this was in the path, or that independent writing outside of academia was in the path, or that any kind of artistic production was in the path, I would have taken business classes. In that moment where you're paying tuition for a full ride and you are in a university as a registered student with a really good business school, I would have taken an accounting class. I never took anything like accounting, taxes, inventory management. Like, these are things that you can do in business school, and it's right down the street from you. And I genuinely, like, when I was at Cornell in particular, like, we had a real good business school, and I really, I think at the time, being sort of liberal arts PhD student, like, didn't look very kindly on business school, and in a lot of ways I still don't. But gosh, there are skills that I could have learned a little less the hard way. Basically, any job that does not look like a university job or a corporate job, anything that looks gig economy-ish or small business-ish, you need to learn those skills.
Yeah, and it's access to that information that is so that information and those kinds of mentors and things that you just don't have as easily outside of the college setting. that you just do have access to. I think, you know, to kind of flip it around and be like, what do I as a business owner want grad students who are studying comics to know? Man, comics are the way they are for a lot of reasons, and one of them is like distribution, production, and publication. Talking to somebody who is in, you know, if you're working on a project, I'd say especially if you're working on like an obviously more kind of pop culture product, but frankly, you know, even the artsiest stuff, if it gets published, it has to go through this process. It has to be marketed. It has to go through stores. Even if it's just like 3 stores in the whole world, it's still stores. And gosh, you know, you can know in theory that these forces affect the product. Boy, does it get driven home when you're reading like a solicit, or, you know, seeing the interviews, or hearing the discussions with the artists, or seeing all the different covers and how many covers, and who publishes what, and all of these kinds of things. Have a huge.
And how does distribution work? And why should you never ever self-publish with Amazon if you want your book to appear in stores?
I think we have a question in the chat. I'm just gonna open the Q&A here, because Bruno asked something that I think sort of pertains to that. So Bruno Porto asked, I've been under the impression there's more TBPs and other collected editions lately than floppies, generally speaking, of course. Is that somewhat accurate? Would it be because a TBP makes the same display space as a monthly issue, but sells for more?
So I think there's a few elements here. One, I do not think that there are fewer floppies. There are 17 books with Batman in them right now. There are a lot of single issues coming out. I think Andrea and I both intentionally shelve fewer of them. I don't think it's actually because of your final conclusion that they take the same space but sell for more. I think that they are 2 things. They are very appealing to, so they actually sell for less if we're being finicky about it. In general, unless it comes from Marvel, your collected edition costs less than the single issues that go into that collected edition. So if an image single issue sells for $3.99 and a paperback has 6 single issues in it and sells for $20, that same amount of story is cheaper to get by 1 issue worth, right? You get 1 issue free. But trade paperbacks are much, much more appealing to what one might just specifically call the casual reader, but I think is more accurately a binge reader, someone who is not interested in coming in monthly for a comic, but is very happy to come and spend $200 twice a year and catch up on their stories. Those readers also tend to skew female, and so the people who don't want a subscription, who don't want to store floppies, who have bookshelves in their homes rather than long boxes, lots of reasons that there is an easier market for trade paperbacks. The other thing is that they are, trade waiting is another word for it. But the other thing is that lost my train of thought. I had another thing. It'll come back to me.
About bookstores?
Andrea, go. No, exactly. So trades sell. So a good trade is perennial, right? I can keep a good trade on the shelf for years. I can keep Saga, Sex Criminals, and Smile and Sisters, certainly on the kids' side, on the shelf for decades, right? And it used to be that there is a shift in publishing, and I think what you might be looking at, Bruno, is that it used to be that really, really good series got collected. So Watchmen was a trade, but not everything DC made in the 90s turned into a trade. These days, unless a series flops and it comes from a major publisher, there will be a trade paperback. Even then, sometimes they will try again putting the same content out in a trade. And it's really just appealing to a different customer base. So I definitely have books that I get in singles. They just sit there in singles. And then when the trade comes out, it moves. So
yeah.
Andrea, do you have something to add?
Well, what I was saying with bookstores is that regular bookstores carry them. When I was working at Barnes and Noble in early 2000s, when I was in high school and early college, there were a couple of comic books in the magazine section, but not very many. But you could get collected books there. And that also means that when we look at sales numbers, there's just a wider reach because there are more bookstores than there are comic book stores, more and different people go to your bookstores than go specifically to comic book stores. And so when we talk about sales, when we talk about growth, when we talk about where a lot of publishing incentives are, they often line up on trades because it's also, it goes to a wider audience. A lot of casual comic readers don't read single issues. They just don't. It's expensive. It takes up a lot of time. You have to go in once a month. And frankly, from a formalist perspective, most comics are not made with the serial format really in mind. They're mostly thinking about if they're thinking about it in sort of serial format, they're thinking about the serial of the trades, not the serial of the single issues.
With a few really notable exceptions that I will totally sing the praises of.
Absolutely.
Sometimes they're great. Some people just think in 24 pages, and bless them, I love them.
And they're good, but a lot of them just don't. So there's not really any reason to buy the material twice if you're going to buy it, or specifically to go and get the single issue just because you wrote a single issue, which is sad. I love the idea of the serial form of comics. I wish it mattered in a way that it just kind of doesn't right now. I often compare it to things like music and vinyl. With vinyl, it's important to think about the whole the form is part of how you listen and experience it. And that's why I think people really like vinyl, not actually because the sound is better. Like, we all know the sound isn't actually better. It's good.
Yeah, but the physical object is extremely cool.
Object is extremely cool. The way of listening to it is extremely cool. It's not like a Spotify playlist or even a CD where you can just easily skip a song you don't like. If children even know what those are anymore. My car's tape deck exploded today.
But it wasn't an 8-track, so.
But it wasn't an 8-track. But it is about that kind of experience of how of the form and its relationship to your experience. And the comic book can be so cool and so powerful, and most people are treating it just like an episode of a Netflix TV show that is meant to be binged instead of watched one episode at a time.
Well, now I feel bad self-outed as a binger. But yes, I was also going to go to Zach's question. I think, Katie, you beat me to it. I'll just read it out for the audience. So Zach said, as a K-12 educator, I'm wondering about relationships/partnerships with schools and your stores. I'm eager to get a comics club going at my school. Yes. And I'm thinking about how that might work in terms of partnering with one of my local comic shops. Any tips or suggestions?
Yeah, so I have a lot of different relationships with different schools. None of them currently involve a comic club, and now I want one. But most of the work I do in partnership with schools is in supplying school libraries. And I do a lot of what librarians call, what is it? There's a word for it, but like reader guidance. I do a lot of making recommendations to libraries for what they should be carrying, or look at the sections they have and make recommendations for where there's holes. And then I also do the work of hunting down, what do you want? What distributor does it come from? Are we able to get it? How many do you need? And work with them at a discount to make sure that graphic novels are in local school libraries. I also have done some specific consulting. So there's a high school teacher in town who is teaching a Marvel comics class right now in his high school. It's like a senior elective. And so him and me and Douglas Wolk sat down and like talked through what would you put in a high school level Marvel class. And then I also played intermediary between him and Marvel Corporate to get all of his students a discount code for Marvel Unlimited so they can read at half price, which is great because he's assigning stuff that's out of print. And so being able to give the students access to Marvel Unlimited is great. What else? So like I regularly invite classes into the store and give talks there, which is lovely. And you should definitely do that if you have like kids to take on a field trip. I love field trips. I had a group of adolescent psychiatric residents come in the other day that are at OHSU, literally to tell them what the kids are into these days, but specifically to talk about graphic novels and adolescent development and queer representation in comics, because that is, if you are an adolescent psychiatrist, Jesus words, that's a lot of what you're spending your time on. And so talking about their advisor keeps a graphic novel library in his office where he works with teens, because it is easier for them to borrow a book they're curious about rather than broach the topic directly. And they can borrow a book and bring it back. And in the meantime, he also read it, and then they can talk about the book, and then they can talk about the kid. And then like immediately following that, I had a GSA in from the Portland alternative schools. So kids who are not in a traditional school, they have school online, and then they get together for social meetings. And so I had a bunch of very sullen, quiet, queer kids in the store, and I talked at them for like half an hour, and then they all like left super happy and like they didn't say any words because teenagering is hard, and then they left really happy. So that's, you know, so I do work with schools, but I don't have any comics club recommendations. Do you, Andrea?
That's really cool. I am, the timing of the shop, as it might indicate, means that like our plan for outreach has shifted and been strange. So the work that we do with schools is not, I haven't done much in schools yet. I'd love to. I've been talking with someone locally about like going to a 5th grade classroom and talking about comics and why they're good for you, and you can actually tell your mom that it's cool to read comics. And I work with schools on like fundraisers and that kind of thing. But we haven't done a comic club. That sounds really cool. I have dreams of like having a dedicated space in the store where people could just like come and draw and work on stuff. I need a bigger space than I have right now. Corey's asking about banned books, particularly at libraries. Yeah, I mean, the stores issue, I mean, there are places that do have where stores are, Virginia most famously is not being allowed. Well, I think it was struck down, but there were challenges to private stores to be able to not sell certain books, particularly genderqueer. I haven't had any issues with book ban. In fact, I had like a banned book display where I put the reason that every book was banned, and I think I sold a shit ton of books off of that display. I'm in a college town in Oregon, so it's not the sort of place where I would expect to hit too much trouble either. I've known other, some of my colleagues have had problems, but I haven't directly faced any problems. I don't assume you've had too many, Katie, but
no, it's something I stay really informed on and I'm definitely concerned about. But also, the federal law around obscenity is that it is determined by the standards of the community, and I am very trusting of my community to have my back. So I like that is the thing that comforts me, is that I I feel very good about selling what I sell in the town where I sell it. And that's, that's luck, right? That's sort of taking an easy way. It would be harder if I was doing this somewhere else. That said, I certainly bite my fingernails every election and, read Handmaid's Tale just like everybody else did. So, doom is on the horizon, but in terms of the local, banned books are very good for my sales numbers.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, for those of you who are comics historians at all, you of course know that like the history of censorship in America in the 20th century is very closely tied to comics specifically. So this is nothing new, but also annoying, nonetheless. To the happier things, Honor is asking about zines and like the local independent comics and how we source and sell those. Here at my store, I just encourage folks to come in. If it's somebody local and it's not like filled with hate speech or anything, I will probably buy at least one or two off of them. Because we want, it's important to, part of building a community of comics fans means building a community of comics artists. And they're great. I mean, not only are they very cool and it helps people feel informed and engaged because they get to participate in their own like process of publication, but zines are great and there's all kinds of cool stuff, and we also get like really great stuff from that. It can get trickier with books, and particularly local books. Sometimes people have like limits, they want to order so many. There have been a few times where somebody's like, I have this deal, I would love to like sell you like 6 of my books, and I was like, I don't know if I can buy 6 of them right up front if it's a full book. Just because we don't know how they'll do and we only have so much space. But it's great. It's a lot of fun. You get to carry all kinds of weird stuff that nobody would ever. We had somebody bring in an amazing zine on neurodivergent food experiences the other day. What great. Yeah, like they're not gonna make a whole book on that, but we have some fun information on that in the store now.
It's I think Andrea and I both pay cash rather than doing consignment. For me, there's 2 reasons that we do that. So consignment is a sort of traditional business model where you bring in a product, but you don't get paid for it until that product sells, and then the shop owner makes the division of profits and gives you money. I don't do that because I am bad at that sort of paperwork. And I hate the idea of a creator not getting paid because I messed up the bookkeeping somewhere. And I would rather lose $4 by buying their zine and then not being able to sell it than I would like to see them not getting paid. Also, it is incredibly satisfying to be the first person to ever pay someone for their creative work. Like, I made this thing, do you want it? And you can say like, sure, give me 3, here's $10. And then everybody goes away very happy. So I love that part of my job. I'm going to put in the chat, just for fun, a link to Turtle Boy, which is one of the silliest zines I carry right now. Turtle Boy is created by 7 and 9-year-old brothers. And there are 4 volumes in of this thing, and I literally sell it every week. I sell a copy of Turtle Boy. People come back for the next one. It makes no sense, but it's actually pretty well drawn for a 9-year-old. And they keep making it. Literally, they come in and sell me their comic and then buy more comics, right? And that's great. I love this plan. I do a little bit more extensive buying than Andrea does. I have one distributor who's wonderful, whose name is Ann Bean, and her company is Emerald Comics Distribution. She comes out, which is kind of a play on diamond, right? She comes out of Seattle, and she drives down from Seattle with her station wagon full of long boxes. And she keeps track of what I have and what sorts of things I sell. And she comes into the store and lays out her wares on my couches and is like, hey, you seem to have sold all of this. If you're selling this, you should get more, and also some of these. And she is just a distro that picks up from like all the Pacific Northwest zine makers and then sells them. She's great. She works very hard, and she recently hired an assistant, and I'm very glad she did because she works very hard. But I also buy from walk-ins and from people who email. There's some other zine distros who I work with, Silver Sprocket, Birdcage Bottom. So it gets to be a pretty broad reach. And I love that. I love having small indie stuff in the store.
So I have now learned that there's a new career goal in this for me, is become Anne Bean, like just, apprentice with the master. And,
she started doing it because she was driving around her own comics.
Yeah.
And she was like, you know what? I'm not actually terrific at making comics, but what I'm really good at is selling them to comic shops. Why don't I do that for other people?
That is, I love that so much. That is the best storage in. I mean, that's the takeaway for all of us is just now Turtle Boy for the win. Yes, there must absolutely be t-shirts. Conference, the Turtle Boy elements. I mean, that's wonderful. We have almost reached time. I do want to give you both a chance. If there's any social media presences that you would like to give a shout out to, you're welcome to pop them in the chat or talk about them. Obviously, the stores themselves are in Oregon, which means that I'm super privileged because I get to visit both of you, which I will happily do. So if anyone wants to come up here for a comic book store and they need, a place to crash, I will happily facilitate that. But yeah, so if there's any social media presences you want to give a shout out to, or also if you have any quick mentions of something that you're reading right now to get us, give us all something for the fall days when it's dark out and you might just snuggle up.
So my social is Books W Pictures, I believe pretty much everywhere. Facebook, maybe Books W Pictures PDX or something like that, but we're pretty findable. In general, the Portland store's icon is a squirrel with a pink bow that is Tippy Toe the squirrel. So in general, if you see a squirrel with a pink bow, that's us. And Andrea?
Most places were BWP_EUG. And it might be different on Facebook as well, but Insta, thank you. Insta, Twitter, TikTok. I do occasionally TikTok because I'm down with the youths despite my tape deck.
I'm figuring out Mastodon, which I'm pretty sure is just people over 40, but that's fine. I'm figuring it out.
But for Zach's question, how can you support us from a distance? First of all, thank you. We appreciate that. Online ordering is great. I think both of us have online stores and we ship pretty much anywhere. In fact, I did a project with Kelly Sue DeConnick about Wonder Woman Historia, and we shipped to 37 states and 7 countries, I think. So we can ship anywhere, you just kind of have to pay for it. But, happy to work with you for orders, or you can poke around at stuff we got in the store, you can buy a gift card. All of those kinds of things work really well.
And the other thing that we do, it's actually specifically staffed at this point because it's really quite popular, is that we do personal shopping at the Portland store. So we've got a form that you can get to from our website. That is tell us how much you want to spend and tell us what you like. And a staff member will pick out, $50 worth of trades for you that are just the thing you need. So we did a ton of that during the pandemic when our doors were closed, which was great, both because it let us do the kind of exploratory recommendations that we're very good at, and because it let us shop our back stock when we weren't getting new shipments from Diamond. And so we were like, here's a super obscure title that I happen to have 4 of. I can't get the thing you want, but I can get this. And so that was a good way to keep the inventory churning when things were really tight.
We did that a bit. Sales kind of dropped, so we don't have a thing on the site anymore for it, but always happy to do it. And I'm probably gonna try kicking it off again next year.
It's pretty fun. Oh, and we also have subscriptions that you can buy as gifts that are $20 a month as a recurring charge, and are in a few different categories. That's also on our shop. So for kids and adults, single issues and trades, we will make you a gift package and send it to you every month for $20 plus shipping.
Yeah, and
pretty fun.
we do a book club every 6 weeks or so, that I try to keep open, either YouTube live or Zoom or something. So you can keep an eye on our socials and see what we're reading and pop in on the book clubs if you want. Next up is Lonely at the Center of the Earth, which, what am I reading? That was the one that I read right now. It's Lonely at the Center of the Earth, excuse me, by Zoe Thorogood, who is pretty stunning young artist.
Speaking of prodigies, gosh, her line work is ridiculous.
Insane. I liked, is it The Impending Blindness of Billy Scott? Is that the full title of the first?
That was her last and first work.
Really, I think so. Yeah, she did a really great adaptation. She did the drawing, and I think the coloring as well. Maybe not, for adaptation of Joe Hill's short story Rain. That's fantastic. Like, I didn't want to like that book, and I ended up falling in love with it. And yeah, her newest.
You can't start with lesbian death and keep me on board, but she did.
She did. It's Raining
So
Crystals.
irritated.
And terrible. Yeah. I am about to crack into Shuna's Journey. I'm excited about that.
Nice.
I'm a big Miyazaki head. But that's where I'm at.
And I just finished My Aunt is a Monster, which is a new middle grade by Yaminia Yi, which whose last book was Seance Tea Party, and it is about our young protagonist who is blind, whose parents died tragically in a fire where she also loses her home, and so she gets sent to live with her stranger to her aunt, who happens to be cursed into being a giant blue monster. And also her nanny, aunt's nanny, who has become her life partner, and their invisible pet. And they wind up going on a giant sort of Indiana Jones vibes adventure.
All right.
And it's terrific.
I was just going to type thanks for coming to Corey.
Bye, Corey. Too late.
Too late.
No, thank you so much. I mean, this is wonderful. I wrote some names down there, and I mean, Andrea, I can bother you anytime I want. Well, not anytime I want.
It's not bothering. I love to talk about it. And I don't know if Finley was in, but also, like, another thing you can do as a grad student uniquely is hire former students of yours who were very good and who you enjoyed to run a business with you, because that works. That's one thing you can do.
See a plan for me here. But thank you both so much for your time, for offering to have this conversation with us. I really enjoyed myself, took a lot of notes on the side. If folks have any future questions, you gave your social media, so I'm sure they can reach you. The GSC will host a similar event later next year, so keep your eyes peeled for those announcements, and just thanks everyone for coming out, especially since it's late wherever you are. And just have a good rest of the week, and may there be no more cars on fire, flash tape decks on fire.
None.
That's
zero.
We no
Zero
more
cars
of that.
on fire. It's the correct number.
All right, have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
All right.
It's
Thanks.
great to meet you all. Bye.
Thank you for some. Yeah, thank you. This is amazing.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, Andrea, Katie, thank you guys so much for being here and doing this. I mean, this is our second PD event, and I mean, it